Chapter 4 of And So They Were Married by Florence Kingsley. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Michele Eaton. "If you can give me just a minute, Richard, before you go out." It was Mrs. North's timidly apologetic voice which broke in upon her husband's hasty preparations for a day's professional engagement. Dr. North faced about with a laughing twinkle in his eyes. "I know your minutes, Lizzie," he said, absent-mindedly sniffing at the cork of a half-emptied bottle. "This gentian's no good. I've a mind to ship it back to Avery's and tell them what I think of the firm for selling adulterated drugs. It's an outrage on suffering humanity. I'll write to them anyway," and he began to rummage his desk in quest of stationery. "I want to speak to you about Bessie's things," persisted Mrs. North. "You know you gave me some money for her wedding clothes last month, but it won't be nearly enough." "What on earth have you been buying for the child?" asked her husband. "I should think with what she has already, the money I gave you would go quite a ways." "That's just it," sighed Mrs. North. "Bessie thinks none of the things she has are suitable." She hesitated a little over the hard-worked word. "Of course, living in Boston and—" "Pooh! Boston's no different from any other town," put in the doctor. "You tell Bess I said so. She doesn't need to worry about Boston." He plumped down in his office chair and began an indignant protest addressed to the firm of Avery & Co., wholesale druggists and dealers in surgical supplies. "I haven't bought any of her best dresses yet," sighed Mrs. North, "and she wants an all-over lace for her wedding dress. Miss Tripp says they're very much worn now." She paused suggestively while the doctor's pen raced busily over his page. "You didn't hear what I said, did you, Richard?" she ventured after a while. "Yes, my dear, heard every word. You were saying you'd bought Bess a lace wedding dress, and that Miss Tripp says they're very much worn," replied her husband, fixing on a stamp with a sounding thump of his big fist. "Glad to hear it. Well, I'll have to be moving now. Good-bye." Dear, home to dinner if I can. If not—" "If you could let me have $250, Richard," said Mrs. North rather faintly, "we'll try to manage with that for the present." "Well now, Lizzie, when it comes to your wanting anything, I always get it for you, if I can, and you know that. But I sent off cheques to Frank and Elliot this morning, and I'm what you'd call strapped. Couldn't you collect—" The doctor kissed his wife cheerfully. "How can I, wifey, when folks leave their doctor's bills till the last cent's paid to everyone else? Don't know as I blame 'em. It's hard enough to be sick without having to pay out money for it now, isn't it?" "Oh, Dick, if that isn't just like you. But I've thought of a way." "Good. What is it?" "We might borrow some money on the house. Other people do, and—" "Mortgage our house for wedding finery? I guess you're joking, Lizzie." "At any rate, I'll call it a joke and let it pass. Good-bye." The quick slam of the office door put a conclusive finish to the doctor's words, and his wife went back to her work on one of Elizabeth's elaborate garments with a heavy heart. "What did Richard say?" Grandma Carroll wanted to know, when the girl had gone into another room to be fitted. "He said he couldn't possibly let me have anything more just now," said Richard's wife with a shade of reserve in her voice. "You know, mother, people are so slow in paying their bills. The doctor has any amount outstanding if he could only get it. Such folk had ought to be made to pay before they get Harry a pill or a powder, same's they do for what made 'em sick. They'd find money for the doctor quick enough once they had a right sharp pain from overeating," was Grandma's trenchant opinion. "But I expected he'd say that all along, and I wanted to give you this for Lizzie." She slipped a little roll of bills into her daughter's lap. "Don't say anything to the child about it," she whispered, nodding her kind old head. "It would worry her. Besides, I don't approve of the amount of money she's putting into perishable things. I meant to buy her a real good clock or a nice solid piece of furniture, but if she'd rather have lace frills that'll fall to pieces in the washtub, I'm willing she should learn by experience, same as we've had to do before her." Mrs. North's eyes were moist and shining. "It's what you've been putting by for years, mother," she whispered. "Hush," said Grandma. "I guess when it comes right down to it, I'm full as foolish as Lizzie. Once I set foot in the golden streets I know I shan't mind whether I leave a marble monument in the cemetery or not, and you don't need to either, daughter. Now remember." Upon this hushed conversation entered Elizabeth, in a flutter of excitement and rosy pleasure over a letter which the postman had just handed her. It was from Evelyn Tripp, she said, and she wanted to come to Boston and stay a week with her. "She says she will help me pick out all my dresses, and I'd better have my wedding dress and my going away gown made there anyway. Isn't that lovely?" Then, as she met her mother's dubious gaze, "You know, Malvina Bennett hasn't a particle of style. and we don't know anything about the best places to buy things in Boston, or the dressmakers, or anything." "I've shopped in Boston for years," said Mrs. North, with a show of firmness, "and I'm sure everything at Cooper's gives perfect satisfaction." "Oh, Cooper's!" laughed the girl. "Why, mother dear, nobody goes to Cooper's nowadays. It's just for country people from out of town." "What are we, I'd like to know?" Grandma Carroll wanted to know, with a humorous twinkle in her shrewd eyes. "I shouldn't wonder if you'd better do your shopping with your mother, Lizzie. Her judgment would likely be quite as good as that Tipp's girl's, and more in line with what you can afford. You should remember that Samuel isn't a rich man, and you'll need good, substantial dresses that'll last. I remember I had a blue Russell cord poplin when I was married that I wore for 15 years. Then I made it over for your mother, and she looked as pretty as a pink in it for 2 more. Then she outgrew it and I gave it away, but the cloth in it was as good as new. A dress like that pays." Elizabeth laughed somewhat impatiently. "I've heard about that wonderful poplin ever since I can remember," she said. "I wonder you didn't save it for me. But I don't want to buy any dresses that will last for 15 years. I'm sure Sam can buy me more dresses when I want them. I may go to Boston, mayn't I, mother?" Mrs. North looked wistfully at the pretty eager face. She had looked forward with pleasure, somewhat tempered, it is true, by the knowledge of her meagre resources, yet still with pleasure, to the choosing of her daughter's wedding gown, with all its dainty accessories of tulle and lace. "I had thought of a silk muslin," she said rather faintly, "or perhaps a cream satin, if you'd like it better, dear, and—" "I shouldn't like either of those," said the girl decidedly, "and there's so much to do that it will really save time if you don't have to bother with any of that. Evelyn," it was Evelyn and Elizabeth now, "says chiffon over Liberty satin would be lovely if I can't afford the lace. Of course I wouldn't buy a cheap lace." That night when Dr. North came home he tossed a handful of bills into his daughter's lap. "For the wedding gown, Bess," he said. "Worse luck that you want one." "Oh, why do you say that, you darling daddy?" murmured the girl, "when I'm going to be so happy." She was radiantly happy now, it appeared, and the doctor's keen eyes grew moist as he looked at her. "Guess I was thinking about myself principally," he confessed gruffly, "and about your mother. We're going to be lonesome, and I don't like to think of it." The girl's bright face clouded. "The boys will be at home summers," she said, "and I'll come back to visit often, you know. I shan't be far away, daddy." She clung to him for a minute without a word, a faint realization of the irrevocable change so near at hand sweeping over her. "Of course you will, Betsy Jane," vociferated the doctor, affecting a vast jocularity for the purpose of concealing his feelings, which threatened to become unmanageable. "If you don't show up in Innisfield about once in so often, I'll come to Boston with my bag and give that young robber a dose that will make his hair curl." The next day the bride-elect journeyed to Boston, carrying what appeared to her a small fortune in her little handbag. "You've all been so good," she said. "I can just buy everything I need with all this." Evelyn Tripp met Elizabeth in South Station with open arms. "How well you are looking, you darling," she exclaimed effusively. "Now, if we can only keep those roses through all the shopping and dressmaking. It is so exhausting, but I've everything planned for you down to the last frill, and Madame Pryse has at last consented to make your gowns. If you knew what I'd been through with that woman, she simply will not take a new customer. But when I mentioned the fact that you were to marry a nephew of Mrs. Mortimer Van Duser, she finally capitulated. I could have embraced her." "But Sam isn't Mrs. Van Duser's nephew, Evelyn. I believe his mother was Mrs. Van Duser's second cousin." "Oh, well, that doesn't signify. I'm sure I had to say something convincing, and Mrs. Van Duser was my dernier ressort. Pryse will do anything for you now, you'll see, my dear. And oh, Betty dear, when I was in at Altford's yesterday I just chanced upon the most wonderful bargain in a lace robe, and had it sent up on approval. The most exquisite thing, and marked down from $127 to, what do you think, only $89.50. I was so pleased, for I am sure it is just what you want. I got samples too of the most bewitching silks for your dinner gown. You must have at least one, you know, a simple pretty crêpe de chine or something of the sort, and then with a little frock or two for luncheons and card parties, your tailor-made, that must be good, and your wedding gown for evening affairs. You will do nicely." "But, Evelyn," interrupted Elizabeth timidly, "I'm afraid I can't. You know I didn't expect to buy but 2 dresses in Boston. Malvina Bennett is making me a black suit, and—" Miss Tripp paused to smile and bow at a passing acquaintance. Then she turned protesting eyes upon the girl. "You dear child," she murmured. "You're not to worry about a single thing. That's just what I mean to spare you. I am determined you shall have just what you are going to need. And if you haven't enough money with you, I can arrange everything at Altford's without a bit of trouble. And of course you will pay Pryse her bill when it is perfectly convenient for you. She doesn't expect to be paid promptly. Really, I don't believe she would have a particle of respect for a patron who insisted upon paying for a gown the minute it was finished. First-class modistes and milliners, too, are all that way. They know better than to send their bills too soon. So that needn't bother you, dear. And, of course, Pryse finds everything, which will save enormously on your outlay." Elizabeth felt very meek and hopelessly countrified as she laid off her wraps in Miss Tripp's rather stuffy but ornate little apartment. Mrs. Tripp, a faded, apologetic person smelling of rice powder and sachet, smiled vaguely upon her and murmured something about Evie's wonderful taste. One thing at least was clear to Elizabeth as she lay wide-eyed in the darkness that night, after an evening spent in the confusing examination and comparison of fashion plates and samples, and that was the conviction that the fortune with which she had joyfully set forth that morning had dwindled to a pitiful insufficiency before the multiplied necessities imposed upon it by Miss Tripp's undeniable taste and knowledge. She almost wished she had chosen to do her shopping with her mother and Grandma Carroll, as she realised that she would be obliged to write home for more money. But it was too late to change her mind now, and after all, Evelyn knew best as to what a bride about to move in polite circles in Boston would require. She went to sleep at last, and dreamed of standing up to be married in a Russell cord poplin, whatever that wonderful fabric might be, which had already done duty for 15 years, and was as good as new. End of chapter 4. Recording by Michele Eaton.